Hello everyone, my name is Mihai Vasilescu. Together with me is Bogdan. Today we're going to talk about crypto mining campaigns and some thoughts around this. We both work at CrowdStrike as threat detection engineers, and we're focused on the Linux and cloud runtime space, hence our interest in this area as well. We're going to have a quick intro into containers and some concepts related to container security. Then we're going to dive in a bit on some adversaries, namely Team TNT, and how they've evolved in the past years. A quick demo, and then we're going to share some thoughts about how we see these threats evolving in the future. Bogdan?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we'll start with a quick container overview from a security point of view. Okay, so what is important for you to remember is that from the host perspective, a container is just another PID. If you take a look at this picture, can you see my pointer? Okay, so great. So first, we try to list any Nginx processes on the host, and we don't see anything. Then we run a Docker container with Nginx, and at the bottom of the picture, we can see when we try to list the Nginx process again, we can see there is a process there running under root for Nginx. So like I said, a Docker container or a container is just another PID. So how this PID is isolated from other PIDs running on the host? So there are two main mechanisms. There are namespaces and there are C groups. And from a very high level perspective, the namespace limits what you can see, and the C groups limits how much can you use. Okay, so on Linux, there are 8 namespaces. We won't talk about all of them. We'll just go very briefly over the PID namespace. So at the top, we run a very basic Ubuntu 24 container, and if you try to list the processes inside, we can see that we only have 2. We have the bash and also the PID of the PS, but at the bottom, if you try to run the same container, but this time we're trying to, or we are giving the parameter --PID equal with host, we can see that now we can see multiple PIDs. And what is different, or what happens in the background, is if we use the read link to list all the namespaces for the Ubuntu process, we can see that the number, the inode number there, is different from the Docker container. But if we run the same container again, sharing the PID host name, we can see that the inode number for the PID is the same one as in the first command execution. So basically what this means is that now the container can see all the processes that the host can see. Now, moving on to C groups. So by default, a Docker container, and keep in mind here we're talking about Docker as a container runtime, is that it has no resource constraints. So we can create a very basic C script like there and can run a fork bump. How you can check that indeed what I said is true is we can create a Docker container with a very basic sleep command inside the container. We can get the PID of that sleep command, and then we can list the C groups for that sleep command, and then for our PID for our Ubuntu user. So if you look here at the bottom, there is a file called memory.max in which you can see how much memory a process can allocate or use. And for both the PID of my current process and also for the PID of the container, we can see that there is the value there is max, meaning that they can use as much memory as the hardware can have. Now, so besides those two principles, like for isolation, like namespaces and C groups, we'll also have container security controls. So we have capabilities, max, and syscall security. So before kernel 2.2, there was only 1 and 0, like a privileged process or unprivileged. But after kernel 2.2, now the privileged process has, let's say, flavors. And let's see here how capabilities work. So we try to run a container and we drop all the capabilities inside. We run a dummy sleep command, and then we are trying to use trace to attach to that sleep PID, and we can see that that operation is not permitted. But if we run the same container again, this time with adding the sysptrace capability, we can see now that we successfully attached to PID 10, which is the bit of the sleep process. How you can check this is we can also grab the capabilities from the proc-speed and status file, and in the first process where in the first container where it dropped all the capabilities, we can see that the effective capabilities are 0. And if you try to run that same container with now adding the sys trace, we can see that we have the effective have a value, which if you decode it with that tool at the bottom, we can see that the container had kept sys trace, and that's why it worked to run the command. Now, moving on to syscall security, we have second profile that basically is, let's say, is just a file that allows us to write there some syscalls. And basically how it works is that all syscalls that are not present in that loaded profile are denied. So let's take an example here. So this is like a print screen of a default profile, and you can see that at the bottom we have the unshare syscall, but it's like restricted, meaning that we can use that unshare syscall only when we have also the sysadmin capability. And in the right picture, if we're trying to run a Docker container and we are trying to use the unshare tool, which actually we use the unshare syscall, the operation is not permitted. But if you add the sysadmin capability and run the unshare command again, now it works because, yeah, like the profile says, we can use the unshare when we are sysadmin. Now moving on to MAX, mandatory access control. Basically, this is like a more advanced method of allowing or denying access to a resource. So for example, let's say that for some reason I want to deny access to etc password file inside the container. I can create a profile in which I can write a basic command like that where I deny read access to etc password. And usually when I try to cat in a normal container, I can cat that file, but if I load that custom profile that I just created up in the top picture, I can see that I can no longer cat that file. Now, a very basic and high-level architecture of Docker and how it works, because this will be very helpful to understand the later text that my colleague Mihai will show, is so we have a Docker client where you issue commands like docker build or whatever command you want to run. We have the Docker daemon, which is listening for commands from the Docker client, and which is responsible for creating containers, pulling images, and we have the registry which is storing images, and that registry can be like on the public, like Docker Hub. You can have a private registry, whatever you want to run. Now, usually when you install Docker on your local machine, the Docker CLI and the Docker daemon are running on that same machine, and they are communicating over Unisocket. But let's say that you want to have the Docker CLI on a machine, and you want to have the Docker daemon on another machine. So you can do that by setting up or by exposing the Docker API, which will become a RESTful API, and they will communicate over a TCP socket. And this is very important because this is how Cryptominer attacks works, basically. Now I'll hand it to Mihai.
So just a really quick summary. So we have all these security concepts, all these methods of securing, creating restrictions when we run Docker containers. But there's a very important distinction when we look at it. It all depends on you or us when we run the containers to specify the limits or the restrictions that we want to impose to those containers. Once you expose the Docker daemon on TCP, for example, you expose it on the internet, there is no, let's say, default way to say, hey, whatever gets run, or commands that you run to, you command the daemon to create or run containers, you cannot impose some limits by default. It depends on the user when they run that container. And so we'll see how that's important. So that's just like a quick stop. So cryptomining, nothing new, process of mining cryptocurrency. It's not illegal unless you run it on someone else's infrastructure, right? And that's kind of what's been happening for the past, let's say, more than 5 or 6 years. To give you a bit of a scope on how they're still fairly prevalent, we see, so these are like roughly 30,000 detections that get triggered off through our clients on a weekly basis. Yeah, these figures can depend on, new campaigns showing up. We'll probably see more spikes, but in, let's say, slower periods, this is kind of what we see. And the reason for that is there's a very low cost to, let's say, pushing or running this sort of an attack. You basically need very basic shell scripting. You need one server to start, let's say, some scanning for exposed Docker APIs, and then you're pretty much set. So we're going to look into a bit into Team TNT. They started the campaigns somewhere around 2020. Some of their initial campaigns relied on Redis. It's actually kind of interesting that throughout this period, at some point, I don't have an exact date, but Redis kind of disappeared on the, let's say, crypto mining space. There used to be a lot of campaigns targeting exposed Redis APIs, use those via, like, establish persistence via cron tabs, and essentially create a, say, sort of a worm. Beyond that, and we'll talk a bit about why this happened, why the disappearance of Redis in this space happened a bit later on. Once, with the Redis and all that, we have also started seeing Docker APIs being abused, which is kind of the main topic around here. And then further down the line, even Kubernetes APIs being targeted. Somewhere around last year, we've seen kind of the last bigger campaign. I don't think they're kind of a dormant phase. We still see some activity that we can kind of go attribute to them, but it's been more in a silent area. Typical attack flow from around this goes to scanning exposed the Docker APIs, and then there's kind of two main ways that they would approach this. They would either deploy some custom containers, like in this case, like from an account NLMM99. This has been thoroughly documented, and we've actually seen them even now after all this time. They still periodically push new container images there. I think the last one they pushed was like 4 months ago, and it looks more in a testing phase, I think. The other option would be to push out to run some Alpine containers or Ubuntu containers, something fairly innocent looking, and then we'll use curl, wget or whatever to download additional payloads, and essentially create this worms kind of a cycle where they start scanning different parts of the internet again, publish the results to their servers, and so on and so forth, infect other machines. Now, one of the initial init scripts that they would use in the Alpine containers, for example, would look something like this. They would basically they would use masscan to scan some random IP ranges, use zgrab to grab the banners from the exposed, let's say, Docker APIs, look for a specific version. If that's okay, then they would use a command to upload those results to basically have a database, and then essentially run this command, basically connecting to the Docker API, running an Alpine container, and downloading additional payloads and executing those. Some of the later campaigns, actually this is the last, the one that we've recently seen. It's fairly similar. Again, masscan, zgrab, again uploading the exposed IPs and the ports, so they can use that for later targeting, and then essentially connecting to that target, running a privileged container in this case, and this one is a custom image that they built and stored on Docker Hub. Just a quick comment here that while some of these accounts have been up for a fairly long time, I think there's I'm not really sure why have they not been, let's say, taken down. But I think there's a bit of a distinction between, hey, I'm running, again, Cryptominers on itself is not something malicious. So if I publish a Docker image on Docker Hub that, is just another off-the-bill Cryptominer, that's not something malicious on itself. The fact that I'm not pushing it out to someone, but someone else uses it, that there's nothing that ties me to any criminal, let's say, or malicious intent. How these are abused, I think there's a very fine line that they're abusing for this kind of activity. And this is basically what one of their older images would look like. Now, in some cases, they don't even download the XMRig or whatever Cryptominer. They would just add these as, let's say, .dockerd file name. Again, as Melina mentioned earlier, they're trying to blend in some of these file names just for the sake of getting a bit of more time of execution, let's say. Some of the other scripts that they would use would be for SSH pivoting. So they do have these like base64 encoded scripts. And once they'd land on in a container, ideally using that privileged option that I mentioned, they would be able to escape that container, go onto the actual, like the host, and look through like known hosts and try to log in there, and again, infect other machines, download payloads, and so on and so forth. And finally, some of the scripts that they'd used for Kubernetes, again, very similar approach, mass scan, grabs the information there, and then run commands to essentially run containers and install curl, download the payloads, miners, and run them. So to give you a bit of an example, like some information on how, let's say, I mentioned the cost for these attacks is very low. We figured, let's give it a shot and see how easy it is to implement something like this. And for the first time we tried this, it took us less than an hour to set up an infrastructure that scans, hosts, downloads, finds exposed APIs, connects to them, downloads a miner, and then even go further and try to steal secrets and exfiltrate those. And I'll let Bogdan give some more info here.
Okay, so we'll switch to the demo time, but before going and present the demo, I want to emphasize something. So when I said that when you want to run the Docker CLI and the Docker daemon on two different machines, and you can expose those and communicate over a TCP socket. So at least now, when you expose it, by default, it's run unencrypted. So
unencrypted.
Yeah. Okay. So that means that you are basically giving access to your Docker daemon to everyone on the outside. So every botnet scanner out there who gets, let's say, a grab of your public IP, basically can run any Docker command on your host. And keep in mind that Docker daemon by default runs with root access. It's not like Podman that is doing some user mapping. The Docker daemon just runs with root access, so basically means that you are giving root access on your machine to everyone outside. Okay, so like Mihai said, we try to replicate and see how easy or how hard it is to do the same. So what we did was we exposed the Docker API, and then we created the dummy Docker Hub account in which you stored definitely not Cryptomining image, and then we also used an Alpine basic command. So we also replicated the init.sh bash script with the script for persistence, and also a bash script in which we grabbed credentials. And then we uploaded those credentials to our CTU server. Now, let's see if this works. Okay. So we have, for this demo, we have two examples. So in the left corner at the bottom, we are running, let's say, how to call it? Basically, we are running our product, which has prevent functionality. And in the right, we are running an open source, like I think we run Falcon there. But Falcon doesn't have prevent functionality, it only have detect. So here in the command, I'm not sure if you can see here, we are running Docker on that Falcon endpoint. 2375 is the default part for unencrypted Docker API, and we just used our Cryptomining image that we published on Docker Hub. So, one second to complete that Docker pull image. Okay, so just to emphasize this, so basically what we're trying to do here is we are trying to look at the memory on both machines. On one machine we have the prevent, so basically it will kill the miner when it detects it, and on the other side where we have only detect functionalities, we can see that the memory right now is due 84 or something like that, and after that miner executes, and we'll see soon the process. Okay, so you can see now the xmrig process, which executes here, and the memory starts rising up until it almost depletes it. I think we stopped the demo before, but yeah, basically what it does when you have only detect functionality, the miner will just take up your entire memory. Okay, here we have some logs from Falco in which we detected. Here you can see the command line, like we have an xmrig, stratum, the parent, and so on, which was, and actually you can see here the command, which was in this case detected, and at the bottom we have the process kill for the miner. So the memory wasn't spiked at all.
Just as one more item, going back to this. So for the purpose of the demo, what we did was, okay, let's try to figure out, say, both you either want to run a commercial product or you want to run something open source. They might have or might not have some rules to detect this kind of behavior, but what we essentially started looking into is, okay, how hard it is to actually write some rule sets for something like Falco to start detecting these kind of behavior. And essentially, it's really not that difficult. You can easily write something that looks for something like stratum TCP or stratum SSL or whatever in a command that based on execv, if I remember correctly. And this will be something that you'll easily pop up in your logs to catch this sort of behavior. So it's something that in my mind is, the point of this was to emphasize running something for like a security product and is not something that necessarily has to be like commercial. It can be something open source, and it's easy enough to detect this sort of behavior. Sorry.
Okay, and here we can also see the logs for the persistent process.
I think there's my own demo. Yeah. I'd see them.
Okay, so we can see here in the Falco line here, basically the persistence was, we just added a public key inside the authorized key, so we can SSH into it later if you want to like have a backdoor functionality. And also here on the commercial product, yeah, we can see this command was prevented, so there was now a key added in the authorized file.
So one of the things that kind of I think is really important to emphasize is once you expose that Docker API with, let's say, an attack infrastructure like this, once you run that command against a vulnerable target, it takes less than 15 seconds to get something running, grab credentials and anything, as long as it's not, you don't have something that to stop it, kill it, or whatever. So anything that's on your host, so if you remember everything that Bogdan mentioned in the beginning, like AppArmor, SecComp, and capabilities, those are not up to you. They are up to the attacker when they run that Docker command, if they want to use them. They can run something like, say, hey, run this container with privileged and mount the file system on / so then it can just switch over to the host and, get root access on your server, let's say. And that's kind of one of the things that we noticed. A lot of the security, like good practices that are mentioned or around Docker are focused on how you use them, how you should use them in the proper way. Like run a container as a non-root user, limit resources and all that. But from this standpoint of the attacker, the only thing that can prevent this sort of attacks is don't expose the Docker daemon. Once you put that out there, it's basically a loose cannon with no stops. On the other hand, there are ways that you can make this attack, you can stop this attack. So one of them is obviously don't expose that Docker API, and if you really have to, there's documentation on the Docker website to configure it to use TLS authentication. So that'll weed out most of the problems. And obviously, what we mentioned, use some runtime security to get some monitoring, get some detection, prevention around this. Finally, one of the other options that we've explored was Docker rootless, and we'll go just a bit into it. And this is something that we just added last. I was reading out and doing some tests last evening, and was looking through the Docker documentation. So one of the things that finally they're going through is they mentioned that they will disable completely unauthenticated TCP binding for the Docker API. It's only been 6 years since this has been going on, but they mentioned that their target is for the V28 release. So that got me kind of excited, like, let's see if it actually is there. The latest release is 28.5 or something. And the logs, when you actually when you expose the Docker API and look through the logs for Docker, you can see some messages. Support for listening on TCP without authentication or explicit intent to run without authentication will be removed in the next release. But this is already 28.5.1. And I've had an older VM, so I started looking into there, like, when was this? And this one was, this is a version that was released, I think, in 2024. So it's not out there yet, but, yeah, it's probably going to take, I don't know how much time, but this is something that's finally going to be fixed. And if you remember that I mentioned Redis earlier, this was the same situation with Redis. They did some changes. I was quite curious a couple of months ago why there's no more like Redis campaigns. And essentially what they did was the Docker, the Redis server no longer runs as root. There's some changes that prevent, say, if you actually manage somehow to, well, you can't you can't let unauthenticated, let's say, users run commands on the TCP exposed 000 whatever, unless you specify as an option when you start the server. So you have to do that, then you'll be able to run commands, but you won't be able to use things like, I want to write something into etc cron tab or whatever folders, because the service now has some options that limit the Redis server where are the locations that you can actually read-write, and those are tied to var lib Redis, var log Redis. So if you really want to do that, allow that as well, there's a lot of other hoops that you have to go through to essentially allow yourself to get hacked through Redis now. And that was a nice thing to look for. And I think that once Docker is going to push out that update, we're going to see some interesting changes, I guess, into this area.
Okay, so you mentioned that. So I mentioned at the beginning that you have that functionality in which you can run rootless containers. So basically. And I mentioned also Podman. So the difference between Podman, which is also a container runtime as Docker, is that the daemon it's like daemonless because it doesn't use the same namespace as the root user. So in other words, as you can see here in this picture, the PID process, for example, let's go again. So we try to list with Podman and PS, we try to list the containers, and then we inspect that container to grab the PID. And at the bottom, if you try to inspect the details of that PID, we can see that PID is running under Ubuntu user, but at the bottom, for the container that we've just created and inspected here, we can see that inside the container we are root. So basically what this means is that the container believes that he is root, but actually on the host, all the commands, even if an attacker would be able to compromise your container and somehow be able to execute commands on the host, the commands on the host won't be executed as root, as it would be in the case of Docker, but it will run as the Ubuntu user. So this is a very important functionality that we advise you to use in your infrastructure.
So yeah, in conclusion, like all these mining attacks, they are opportunistic. It's an opportunistic threat vector, right? They will leverage exposed APIs. They will leverage vulnerable versions of applications. But yeah, most of the time, what we've seen recently is that they will target these Docker APIs, Docker or Kubernetes APIs. It's going to be interesting going further once that the exposed Docker API will no longer be by default unauthenticated, but we'll see what's the next, let's say, easiest way to run these. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I want to clarify the goal of the attackers. So, if I understand correctly, they penetrate let's say, the end machine, and they use the resources to mine the cryptos, and then gain money from that. Is that correct?
That's one of the goals. The other that we've seen is also for, let's say, stealing credentials, right? Grabbing whatever credential, like AWS or Azure or Docker API logins, and anything that's on the system, SSH keys, updating SSH keys for persistence, anything that's easily, let's say, achieved.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it.
Yeah.
Time.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you for having us.
Later.